Dawn was breaking on the 18th of April, 2018 in the outskirts of Port Vila, the capital of the Pacific island nation of Vanuatu. In a small settlement called Etas, a young mother stirred awake in her parents' home, only to discover that her 6-year-old daughter was nowhere to be found. Moments earlier, the little girl had been sleeping soundly beside her family. Now, in the pale early light, panic set in. An empty mat, a door ajar, and no sign of the child. Neighbours were roused in an instant, spreading out in a frantic search across the nearby bushland and creekside plantations. Only minutes later, a relative stumbled upon a sight no family member should ever have to see. There, on the damp ground near a tangle of sandalwood trees, lay the small, lifeless body of a child, naked, bloody, and utterly still. Florence Yaruel was just 6 years old. She lived with her mother and extended family in Etas, a semi-rural area on the outskirts of Port Vila, Vanuatu's capital city. Like many Vanuatu children, Florence spent her days surrounded by relatives, doted on by her mother, her grandparents, and an assortment of aunts, uncles, and cousins in the village. She was a vibrant little girl, described as healthy and full of life for her age. Petite and curious, Florence had recently started primary school. At home in the evenings, she would fall asleep to the comforting sounds of family members chatting and her grandparents tending a cooking fire. The community of Etas was generally peaceful, a cluster of simple houses amid tropical greenery, where everyone looked out for each other's children. Yet on that night in 2018, a predator crept into their midst. On the evening of April 17th, Florence and her mother, Ms. Lauren Carl, were staying at Lauren's parents' modest home in Etas. It was a typical family household, multiple generations sleeping under one roof, with the pre-dawn hours often beginning early as elders rose to start the cooking fires for breakfast. Sometime after 5 a.m., as the first roosters began to crow in the distance, little Florence awoke and got up from her bed. Her mother would later recall seeing Florence get up and assumed her daughter was heading to the kitchen area to join her grandparents. It wasn't unusual for the child to wander out to her grandparents at daybreak. In Vanuatu's village culture, children often move freely around the family compound, even at early hours, trusting that all adults around are protectors. But on this morning, unknown to anyone in the house, danger was waiting just outside. When Miss Carl herself rose and went into the kitchen around 5:30 a.m., she expected to find Florence there with her grandparents. Instead, she found only her parents tending the stove, no sign of her little girl. A prickling fear arose. Florence should have been either in bed or right here by the fire. Quickly, Lauren checked the other rooms and the yard. The child was gone. The grandmother and grandfather, alarmed, joined the search around the house. Within minutes, their shouts and calls roused other villagers. People fanned out, combing the immediate area, a gravel road, a nearby patch of dense bush, and the banks of a creek that ran not far behind the houses. As the light grew stronger, a few neighbours went further afield, beyond the family compound, and towards a wooded area where a sandalwood plantation stood. It was in that direction, about a quarter of a mile away from the house, that a man from the community, Florence's own uncle, made the tragic discovery. At roughly 6 a.m., he crossed a small creek and on the other side saw the unmistakable form of a child lying on the ground. Rushing closer, he recognized the little girl as his niece, Florence. She was unclothed, and it was immediately apparent from her pallor and the blood near her ears that she was no longer alive. According to accounts later given to authorities, the uncle gently picked up the child's limp body and carried her back towards home. Family members, hopeful against hope, hurried her to the Port Vila Central Hospital, as if urgent medical attention might change the outcome. But it was far too late. Florence, a bright, loving 6-year-old, was dead, the victim of a heinous attack whose details were only beginning to come to light. Police investigators arrived and quickly secured the areas where Florence had likely been taken and killed. It appeared that the child's body had been moved from one spot to another. Her clothes were discovered not at the creek, but discarded some distance away amid the trees of the sandalwood plantation. This suggested that Florence had been abducted and assaulted elsewhere, and that the killer had then carried her body to the creek. The gravity of the situation was unmistakable. What the police were dealing with was the abduction, sexual assault, and murder of a child, all perpetrated within a few hours and within the bounds of a single village community. It was a case that would demand every investigative resource the small Pacific nation could muster. At Port Vila Central Hospital, doctors conducted an initial examination on Florence's body on the afternoon of April 18th. Dr. Sathosawari, one of the hospital physicians, noted bruising and bleeding and concluded that the child had died several hours earlier, likely in the pre-dawn time frame. A full post-mortem examination was scheduled for 2 days later, to be led by Vanuatu's senior pathologist, Dr. George Kalugivaki. The results of that post-mortem were devastating in their detail. Dr. Kalugivaki found that Florence Yaruel had been a normal, healthy little girl in life, and that in death, her small body showed evidence of truly extreme trauma. The cause of death was certified as a severe hemothorax, meaning Florence's chest cavity had filled with blood due to massive internal injuries. Several of her ribs were fractured. Indeed, her entire ribcage had been crushed inward from heavy blows. The membranes around her brain exhibited subarachnoid hemorrhages, bleeding under the surface of the skull, and her brain tissue was swollen and bruised. There were numerous contusions on her scalp, face, and neck, indicating repeated impacts to the head. The autopsy detailed deep lacerations to her lungs and the presence of nearly half a liter of blood pooled inside her chest, which would have made breathing impossible. In short, Florence had been beaten so savagely that she succumbed to internal bleeding and collapsed lungs. The pathologist noted that the injuries to her chest were consistent with powerful punches or blows delivered with great force. It was a ferocious beating, especially unimaginable when inflicted on such a small child. Most harrowing of all were the findings of sexual violence. Dr. Kalugivaki methodically recorded severe injuries to the child's genital area. The damage was unequivocal. Little Florence had been subjected to a brutal sexual assault prior to her death. The post-mortem report concluded there was clear evidence that sexual intercourse had taken place. Forensic swabs were taken with all testing positive for the presence of sperm cells. This meant that investigators now had crucial DNA evidence from the perpetrator. These samples would be sent for laboratory analysis to determine whose DNA it was, but that process would take time. In the meantime, however, the physical evidence already painted a horrifying picture of what the little girl had endured. The community, and indeed the entire nation, reeled as word of the autopsy findings began to circulate. Vanuatu is a country of just over 280,000 people, spread across many islands, a close-knit society where news travels fast and crimes of this nature are exceedingly rare. The police, under enormous pressure to find the culprit, worked around the clock. They combed the plantation area for any additional clues the killer might have left. They recovered Florence's tattered clothing from the ground at the plantation, gathering them as evidence and checking for fibers, fingerprints, or DNA. Before long, investigators began to piece together a timeline of suspicious events that had occurred in the very same area on the night of April 17th. As officers canvassed the neighborhood and took statements, they learned that Florence's family had not been the only ones targeted in those dark, early morning hours. 2 other households in Etas came forward with disturbing reports. An intruder had attempted to break into their homes that night while their children slept. The first incident took place shortly after midnight on April 18th. In a house not far from Florence's, a mother was startled awake by a movement in the room where her 9-year-old daughter was sleeping. By the faint light, she saw a silhouette of a man kneeling beside her daughter's bed. The man had crept into the house silently, but the instant the mother raised the alarm, shouting out in fright, the intruder bolted into the darkness. Mother and child were left shaken but unharmed. About 2 hours later, at roughly 3:15 a.m., a second home was targeted. In that case, the intruder had actually managed to open a window and was attempting to climb into a room where a 4-year-old girl lay sleeping. This time, The child's mother had been alert enough to notice noises, and as soon as she realized someone was trying to enter, she too yelled for help. Again, the prowler fled empty-handed into the night. Both families got only the briefest glimpse of the intruder. It was dark, and he had disappeared almost as quickly as he came. At the time, these incidents were terrifying close calls, but with no one caught and no one injured, they were not immediately reported to the police. By dawn, however, with Florence found murdered, these attempted break-ins took on a new, chilling significance. It appeared that an unknown predator had been roaming Etas under cover of darkness, hunting for young girls. 2 families had narrowly escaped tragedy, and a third had suffered the worst fate imaginable. The pattern was unmistakable. The same criminal likely committed all these acts. He had tried and failed twice before succeeding on his third attempt with Florence. Armed with this understanding, the police zeroed in on the urgent question of who this perpetrator was. A profile of sorts emerged. The intruder had struck multiple times in one locality within a single night. He showed determination and sexual fixation on children, as evidenced by his repeated targeting of girls as young as 4, 6, and 9. He was bold, but also wary, fleeing at the first sign of an adult's resistance, which suggested he might be known in the area and afraid of being recognized. Notably, he appeared to have some familiarity with the community. He navigated through houses in the dark and chose a secluded nearby plantation as the site to commit rape and murder without being noticed. This strongly indicated that the killer was local to Etas or its vicinity. Strangers stand out in small villages. It was highly unlikely an outsider could prowl around multiple houses without someone noticing. The focus therefore turned inward, towards men in the community who might have a predatory history or suspicious behavior. Before long, suspicion crystallized around a particular individual. Neighbors recalled that one man in the area had been acting oddly that week, a man in his 20s who was seen drinking kava and alcohol heavily on the night of April 17th. More significantly, this man was known to police for a prior sexual offense. In fact, he had a criminal record. In 2014, he had been convicted of sexual assault, locally termed sexual intercourse without consent, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He had been released early on parole in September 2016, after serving roughly 3 years of that term. By April 2018, he was 27 years old and back living in the same community in Etas. Shockingly, this meant he had been out of jail for only about 18 months when the new offences occurred. Could it be that this man, a convicted rapist on parole, had turned into a child predator in his own village? The circumstances fit, and the mere possibility prompted swift action from the authorities. Undercover surveillance was initiated on the suspect, and what police observed only increased their suspicions. The man kept a low profile after the murder, but did not leave the village. If he was innocent, one might have expected him to join the community's mourning or express fear about the killer on the loose. Instead, he stayed mostly out of sight. On April 20th, just 2 days after Florence's death, police moved in to make an arrest. The suspect, who by this time had been identified by investigators but not yet named publicly, was located at his house in Etas that Friday evening. Officers placed him under arrest on suspicion of murder and sexual assault and transported him to the police station in Port Vila for questioning. The man did not resist. In fact, as subsequent reports would show, once in custody, he cooperated in several key ways. The day after the arrest, on April 21st, police executed a search warrant at the suspect's home, a small dwelling in the village. The suspect himself pointed out the clothes he had been wearing on the night of April 17th. These items, his shirt and trousers, were seized as evidence. Forensic testing would later confirm that traces of Florence's DNA were found on his clothing, and conversely, that the DNA of the sperm collected from Florence's body matched this suspect. But before the results even came in, the case was about to break wide open through the suspect's own words. On April 22nd, the detained man sat down with detectives for a formal recorded interview. He had been cautioned and informed of his rights. Perhaps realizing the weight of evidence against him, or perhaps driven by his own state of mind, the suspect chose to speak openly. What he revealed was a chilling, step-by-step account of the crime, one that matched and filled in the gaps of what the investigation had already surmised. According to the police, the suspect confessed fully to abducting, raping, and killing Florence. In his own blunt words, he admitted that he had been roaming the area that night, essentially hunting for a victim. He confirmed that he had indeed entered the 2 other houses earlier in the early hours of April 18th, intent on finding a young girl to satisfy his urges. When those attempts failed, he said, he continued wandering through the village. By the approach of dawn, he happened to pass by the Yaruel family's home and saw little Florence outside. The suspect told police that he called out to the child, beckoning her to come to him. When asked why he would do such a thing, the man's answer was as stark as it was horrifying. "I thought I would have sex with her," he said. In that moment, his intention was crystallized. He decided then and there to turn the defenseless 6-year-old into the object of his sexual gratification. Florence, being so young, likely did not understand what was happening when the familiar figure from her community approached. The man later admitted that he had to force her to go with him when she did not comply freely. He grabbed the little girl and picked her up, clamping his hand hard over her mouth to stifle her cries. Florence was terrified and began to struggle, but the man was far stronger. He was a fit 27-year-old, known in the village for having some boxing experience, and easily overpowered the tiny child. Keeping her mouth covered to mute any screams, he carried her roughly about 400 meters, a quarter mile, away from her home, to the sandalwood plantation that lay in a secluded spot beyond the houses. It was still dark. Dawn was just approaching, but as the man noted, not yet light enough for anyone to see them clearly. The plantation was quiet and deserted, an ideal, horrific crime scene where he would be unlikely to be interrupted. What transpired next in that grove of trees is almost too brutal to contemplate. According to the man's own confession, once he had Florence alone in the plantation, he immediately attempted to rape her. The details of what he did next are too horrific to repeat. Hearing her screams, the attacker once again covered her mouth with his hand, smothering her cries to ensure no one nearby would hear. The horror and pain that Florence experienced in those moments are unimaginable. Alone in the dark plantation, the little girl had no chance of rescue. After the assault, the attacker paused and began to reckon with the situation. In his confession, he said that at this point he became afraid, not out of remorse for what he had done to the child, but out of fear of being caught and sent back to prison. He knew that if he let Florence go, she could identify him. The man had already been to prison once. He was still on parole. The thought of returning to a jail cell apparently loomed larger in his mind than any moral compunction. And so, he made a decision that was utterly cold-blooded. Kill the only witness. He described to the police how he carried out the murder. Standing over the small injured child, he unleashed blow after blow to her chest with his fists. The man had trained as a boxer, and he used those skills to bludgeon her to death, as one later court report put it. He struck Florence repeatedly with powerful punches aimed at her torso, effectively breaking her ribs and rupturing her internal organs. The assault was so violent that Florence's lungs were torn and her heart sac likely bruised or punctured, corresponding exactly to the massive hemothorax and internal bleeding the autopsy found. The child's ribcage buckled and broke under the force of his fists. She went silent and limp. To be certain she was dead, the killer also struck her in the head. Indeed, the autopsy noted severe head injuries, consistent with blows or impacts. In a matter of moments, the life of an innocent 6-year-old was brutally extinguished. The man looked down at Florence's lifeless body and confirmed to himself that she was no longer breathing. It was nearly dawn by now. He hastily carried the child's body out of the plantation, moving further away from the direction of her home. He later told police that he carried her to the vicinity of the creek so that others would find her there, even farther from her grandparents' home. By his own admission, the sky was beginning to lighten. He noticed the roosters crowing to herald daybreak, so he hurried. In that dim half-light, he left Florence's naked body on the ground near the creek, exposed and alone in the bush. Her clothes he didn't bother to retrieve. They were left back by the sandalwood trees. His awful deed done, The man then returned to his house nearby. In a final, grotesque detail, he told the police that he went home and simply went to sleep, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The dawn of April 18th found him in slumber, even as the rest of the village woke to the nightmare he had created. This confession, given freely and in great detail, was a major breakthrough in the case. Investigators found it credible and truthful in every respect. On the basis of this interview and the mounting physical evidence, the police proceeded to formally charge him. Within days, charges for abduction, rape, and premeditated murder were laid against the man in the magistrate's court, which handles preliminary proceedings in Vanuatu's justice system. Vanuatu's legal code takes such offences with utmost seriousness. Even the abduction charge alone carried up to 10 years in prison, and the homicide charge, essentially first-degree murder, can carry life imprisonment. The sexual assault charges, notably, were potentially subject to a life sentence each as well, due to a recent change in the law. In 2017, the Vanuatu Parliament had amended the penal code to increase the maximum penalty for sexual intercourse with a child under 13 from 14 years to life in prison. The man was remanded in custody to await trial. At this stage, the name of the accused became public. He was identified in court documents as Bob Robert, a 27-year-old resident of Etas. Public sentiment was running high. Capital punishment had been abolished in Vanuatu at independence in 1980, and no one had been executed there in modern times. But the brutality of this child's murder led many, including Florence's own parents, to argue that the ultimate penalty would be a just fate for her killer. Over the following months, Bob Robert remained behind bars as his case proceeded through the courts. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but initially, Robert had indicated he would plead not guilty, requiring a full trial. A series of delays stretched the case into the latter part of the year, and each delay weighed heavily on Florence's family. They attended each court date, watching the calendar inch towards the first anniversary of their daughter's death with no resolution yet. Finally, in November 2018, Bob Robert's lawyers informed the court that he would change his plea to guilty on all counts. Facing incontrovertible evidence and undoubtedly legal advice that a guilty plea might earn him some leniency, the 27-year-old formally admitted his guilt before the Supreme Court. The looming prospect of a lengthy trial was thus averted. On the 16th of April 2019, almost exactly 1 year since Florence's life was taken, the Supreme Court convened in Port Vila to decide Bob Robert's fate. In a lengthy sentencing remarks, Justice Wiltons outlined exactly what Robert had done and the harm it had caused. The judge noted that at the time of the offence, Robert had been on parole from his earlier sentence, a fact that underscored the brazenness of his actions. This poor innocent 6-year-old child was abused by Mr. Robert while he was on parole in ways that most people in our society simply cannot imagine or understand, Justice Wilton said. In considering the sentence, the court recognized that this case fell at the very highest end of criminal culpability. In Vanuatu, life imprisonment is the maximum penalty available for murder, and now for child rape as well. He then sentenced Bob Robert to serve multiple life sentences in prison. It was, as local media noted, one of the harshest penalties ever recorded in Vanuatu's judicial history. Bob Robert was led away in handcuffs to begin his life term at one of Vanuatu's correctional facilities. By law, he may be permitted to apply for parole after serving 8 years, meaning theoretically as early as 2027. But whether he will ever secure release is another matter. Given the extraordinarily violent nature of his crimes, it is hard to imagine any parole board in Vanuatu approving his freedom in the foreseeable future. As the trial judge said, some crimes are so serious that nothing short of the maximum penalty will do. This was such a crime. A year of legal battles ended with Bob Robert behind bars for life, and a sense that a measure of justice had been achieved for a little girl whose life was cruelly cut short.